Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits, and I'll explain a bit more about the design process and decision making that went into this self-drafted linen top as I finished knitting it this week. So let's get started. Tomorrow, June 10th, is Worldwide Knit in Public Day. So this event happens every year on the second Saturday of June. And the way it works is that individuals, knitting groups, yarn shops, and any entity can organize Worldwide Knit in Public events to celebrate. So there is a website for Worldwide Knit in Public Day that allows people to register their events that they are hosting so people can find them, and for knitters to find those events near them. But if you look at that registry and you don't find anything listed in your area, I would recommend checking the websites of local yarn shops and your local Knitters Guild to see if they have anything planned. You can also check on Ravelry to see if there's a Ravelry group for your city or state and if they have posted a discussion thread announcing a meetup location for Worldwide Knit in Public Day. The Minnesota Knitters Guild, which is where I live, often does have a gathering either at our local brewery or some other type of location. And this year that location is a coffee shop in South Minneapolis. So I'll be heading over there on Saturday afternoon to knit in public. And if you are in the Twin Cities area, you can check the Knitters Guild website for the location, address, and time. But if you're elsewhere in the world, you'll need to do a little investigation to find out if there is a location near you and where that is. You don't have to find a gathering of other people if you want to knit in public. So if that's not an option for you, or if you're just not a group participation person, you can just go to a local park or a coffee shop, anywhere in public, find a seat somewhere and just knit on your own out in public. So I've always found it to be a really fun event, and to see what other knitters in my area are doing and being able to chat with them. So I hope you are able to find something in your area. This tidbit came to me on Instagram from Ollie. It's a schedule of events over the next couple of years. Some are in person in the UK and others are going to be online events. They're all related to making historical dress. The principal investigator of this multi-year event is Dr. Serena Dyer. So if you're like I was, you may not know what a principal investigator or PI is. In the sciences, it's used to refer to the person who is running a particular lab or research project. So it's the head honcho of the research project. I see that term used a lot on Twitter because I follow a lot of sciencey people there, but it can also refer to other areas of academia. Wikipedia tells me that a principal investigator or PI refers to the holder of an independent grant and the lead researcher for the grant project, usually in the sciences, such as a laboratory study or clinical trial. And the phrase is often used as a synonym for head of the laboratory or research group leader. While this expression is common in the sciences, it is used widely for the person or persons who make final decisions and supervise funding and expenditures on a given research project. A co-investigator, co-I, assists the principal investigator in the management and leadership of the research project. There may be a number of co-investigators supporting a PI. So in this case, the Making Historical Dress Network is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, and it's based at De Montfort University in Leicester. So Dr. Dyer is the PI, and her co-I is Dr. Sarah Bendel. Both have written books on fashion history, and I've seen Dr. Dyer speak in an online live stream event in the past. The various speakers for the in-person events include academic scholars as well as YouTubers who focus on the details of historical dress. They've noted that when possible, the in-person events will also be live streamed or recorded. So that may be an opportunity for you if you are not in the UK or don't live anywhere close to where the particular events are going to be. So I'll leave links down in the show notes for the Making a Historical Dress Instagram account, as well as those for Dr. Dyer and Dr. Bendall. This tidbit came to me from Henry on Ravelry. It's a BBC article about how tungsten is being knitted into a fabric used for satellites. The tungsten yarn is super fine, it's practically invisible, and it's knitted on a commercial knitting machine. So when the satellite is launched, the tungsten fabric is folded up into super small, tiny little package. And then once the satellite is actually in orbit, it springs open. In the past few years, I've seen a number of applications in the sciences for knitted fabric using interesting materials. I've talked about them as they've appeared in my view as tidbits. And a few years back, I went to a presentation by a graduate student from the University of Minnesota who was explaining how they were knitting wire to create parts for the Mars rover because it was just flexible and it would withstand the stresses of what was going on Mars. So that was really cool. And I've also seen articles about making medical devices using knitting topology as well. So naturally, there will be a link to that article down in the show notes. This tidbit came to me from bstep56 on Ravelry. It's a 16-minute YouTube video on bobbin lace making at the Met Museum in New York City. So I've seen videos of bobbin lace being demonstrated by the few experts that remain, but the discussion surrounding that demonstration has always typically been about the history of bobbin lace making, how expensive the finished product was, and how the Industrial Revolution put an end to making lace that way, and then changes in fashion led to the demise of most industrial lace making factories. But in this video, the woman demonstrating is explaining the process to the host of the video, and he's asking a lot of really pertinent questions as to how the path of the threads relate to other textile crafts like knitting or weaving. So for me, it was a way to kind of get a better handle on how bobbin lace actually works. So if you've ever wondered what bobbin lace was or wanted to get a more thorough explanation at a beginner level, this is a nice introduction to what is actually going on. So, and of course, there is a link to the video down in the show notes. For the past couple of weeks, I have been working on this self-drafted linen top made with DanDoh linen. It might be DanDoh, I don't know. I heard somebody pronounce it that way last night. I thought it was DanDoh. Rather than designing the entire garment before I cast on, I had some sort of general ideas about sizing and what elements I wanted to include in this top, but I didn't have the entire thing figured out. So I was really kind of designing as I went. Initially, I had thought about having set-in sleeves and possibly a V-neck. By starting at the bottom of the sweater and working upward, I was able to kind of see what the fabric is doing and think more about what elements I wanted to include and how I was going to plan them out. But I was able to just knit the majority of the body while I was making those decisions. So last week, I had the body done up to the underarms. I'd bound off for the underarms, and I was nearly finished with the back. But I still needed to make a decision about the neck shape as well as the edging I was going to use for the neck. By that time, I determined that I would not be knitting set-in sleeves, but I would use a modified drop shoulder construction to shape the armholes. I hadn't fully decided on how long I would make these little sleeves, So I want to go to the overhead and kind of walk you through the decision-making process, and then I'll show you the finished results in a full body shot so you can actually see all of the individual parts. So the body of this top is 15 inches from the cast on edge to the underarm bind off. And then the armhole depth is just over 8 inches, maybe 8¼ inches. When I'm knitting a sweater that has long sleeves and I want those to be set-in sleeves, I will usually have a shallower armhole. And the sleeves will be fairly close fitting. That's just what I prefer. But for drop shoulders and modified drop shoulders, I make the armhole a bit deeper, so 8 inches or maybe even a little longer. Particularly for a summer top, I want to have room around that armhole. I don't want it to be tight fitting. I want to have room, but I don't want it so deep that my bra is going to show on the sides, because one of the goals with this top is to be able to wear it without a tank top or camisole underneath. So the total length from here to here is 23 inches, and then the shoulder shaping is going to add another 3/4 inch or an inch. So a modified drop shoulder construction is, as its name suggests, a modification of drop shoulder construction. With drop shoulder construction, the silhouette of the body would look like this. It would just be straight all the way from the bottom all the way up to the top. The sleeves would be shaped, if they were long sleeves, would be shaped like this, and they would be straight across here. So you would determine where the armhole depth is. You'd usually mark it with a piece of yarn or something so you'd know exactly how deep it was. And you would just sew this sleeve edge, this horizontal sleeve edge, to this vertical edge like that, and that would be how the sweater is constructed. So that is a standard drop shoulder construction. So the edges of this fabric right here are going to be hanging over your actual shoulder by several inches, and that's taken into account when the length of the sleeve is determined. For drop shoulder construction, when you get to the point where the underarm, where the armhole is going to begin, you bind off stitches. So you go inward an inch, inch and a half, something like that, and then you go straight up. And then for this type of sweater, the sleeve shape starts out just like it would for a regular drop shoulder, but when it's at that length that you would have knit a drop shoulder sleeve, then you go straight up vertically like this. And this vertical distance is equal to this horizontal distance. So you end up with that same drop shoulder sleeve up to this point, and then you have that vertical part here. So it essentially fits the same, and it has the same amount of fabric. You have just adjusted where that is, and what happens is that this vertical seam line that you have for the modified drop shoulder isn't hanging over your shoulder. It is closer to where the ends of your shoulders actually are. So it just gives that more tailored appearance, even though the fit is essentially the same. There are some other differences between a drop shoulder and a modified drop shoulder. There's more refinements that you might see with a modified drop shoulder, like shoulder shaping, that you might not see with a drop shoulder. There's a few other things that you might do as well. I cover all of this in my series on sweater types. So we start out with the drop shoulder sweater, and then the next one is the modified drop, and so you understand how these refinements move along. So with my sweater, what I wanted was just to have like a little bit of a sleeve cap, like the amount that it would come over the shoulder with a drop shoulder construction, but I didn't want just this straight edge coming up. I wanted to have this decorative edging that I have down at the bottom. So the sleeve that I have knit for this sweater is just a strip that fits right into there. It just fills that up, and then I'll have the little edging coming along the side. It's just going to come over the shoulder like a little bit of a sleeve cap. So here on my actual sweater, I've got this first sleeve just kind of clipped in here. One of the challenges of seaming something like this into this armhole is that I knit it this way, like this. So this is a horizontal edge right here, but the armhole is a vertical edge. Because the stitch gauge is different from the row gauge, I have 5 stitches per inch, but I have 7 rows per inch. I can't sew this together like 1 stitch for 1 row. I need to sew 1 inch's worth of stitches to 1 inch worth of rows. So I need to be able to sew 5 stitches to 7 rows. I'll go along here and I'm going to probably clip in 10 stitch segments and 14 row segments, and so that as I am sewing along, I can make sure that I'm keeping on track. And the way that you sew 5 stitches to 7 rows is that you do 1 stitch to 1 row, 1 stitch to 2 rows, 1 stitch to 1 row, 1 stitch to 1 row, 1 stitch to 2 rows. So by the time you get through 5 stitches, you will have gotten through the 7 rows. So I have quite a few videos on seaming, and so the one that would be related to this would be horizontal to vertical edges. So seaming a horizontal edge to a vertical edge. So this is a very common thing when you are knitting in pieces and you do have to do some seaming. So let's talk about the neckline. That was the thing that I wasn't sure of. I knew I wanted it to be not like a close neckline. I wanted it to be fairly deep. I was thinking about a V-neck, but I was also thinking about a scoop neck, and I wasn't quite sure. On the day that I was trying to finalize this, I was wearing a tank top. Well, I was wearing a tank dress. So it had a pretty wide scoop, and I liked that depth. I don't have to wear, it doesn't require me to wear anything underneath it, but it's nice and open and therefore cool. And so I just stood in front of the mirror and I measured from the shoulder of that tank dress to the depth of what that scoop was. And I kind of looked at how wide it was and I made my decision about what I wanted to do. In most cases, the neckline is going to be higher than wherever the underarm bind-offs are. Not always. I've knit a vest before that had a very deep V-neck. And so the V-neck opening started before the underarm bind-offs did. But in most cases, even if you have a pretty deep neckline, it's going to occur after the bind-off. And so I decided I wanted to start it about a ½ an inch after I'd done the underarm bind-off. So I knit like 4 more rows and then I started the bind-off. I also decided to make the neck about 6½ inches wide because I wanted the finished neck to be about the opening to be about 6 inches. And so anytime you make a neck opening, then you're going to add something to it. It might be ribbing, it might be some other kind of edging, and that's going to fill in the space. So I wanted the neck opening to be about 6½ inches wide. So with my gauge, that was 33 stitches. So that means I have to eliminate 33 stitches in the center here in order to create my neck opening. So the way I did this was at the base, I wanted it to be ½ an inch above here. At the base, I bound off I bound off 9 stitches here. So that's about 1/3 of the total that I need to get rid of. And then I had a couple of more bind off rows. Each one of these bind off rows bound off fewer stitches than before, and that helps create that kind of curve, wide curve at the bottom. So on each side, I bound off 3 stitches and then 2 stitches. That left 14 more to do altogether. And so I did those with single decreases going up until I had the entire amount. So there were 7 single decreases over here, and then I just went straight up in this direction. So again, I have some videos on how you can plan out different kinds of necklines like V-necks or crew necks or scoop necks, whatever. You determine how deep you want it, and then I show how to do the calculations and go through all of that. So again, I'll leave those down in the show notes. So the final thing that I needed to figure out was what I was going to do on around the neck opening. I didn't want ribbing because I didn't have ribbing anywhere else, and this is linen. It's an inelastic fiber. So I wanted something pretty narrow. but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. So I had two ideas. So the pattern that I used as inspiration, or really the pattern picture I used for inspiration, was a pattern that was published in, I think, 2006. And I think it was a Sirdar pattern. I'll put a picture of it on the screen. And the way they had done the neck was they picked up stitches all the way around, and then they knit a single stockinette round. This I got from somebody's project notes. And then it was just bound off. And some of the project notes didn't really like the way that that looked. And so I thought, well, what if I did that, but instead of just one round of stockinette, I did 2 rounds of stockinette and then bound off. Because I knew that it was going to create a rolled edge, and I thought, well, maybe it would just roll more. With only one row, it might just, what you see would be like the bind off chain, and maybe that wouldn't be so great. So I just used my project as a way to swatch out what I was thinking. So I picked up, I don't know, it was about 4 inches worth of stitches along here, worked a couple of rows of stockinette and then bound off, and looked at what it looked like. Didn't love it, didn't hate it, didn't love it. And then I picked up stitches along here and I did an I-cord bind off. So this I much prefer. First of all, it just basically just hides. It's not that noticeable. And so it just really blends well with the rest of the fabric. Where this, because it's showing the purl side, even though there are some purl stitches, columns in here, it just looked too different. I just didn't like the look of it. It was too three-dimensional. I really wanted something that was just going to look flat and be not noticeable and nice and smooth and nice and narrow. So that is what I'm going to be doing here. Now, what's interesting is they would take up the same amount of yarn. So if I pick up stitches, I have to pick them up regardless. And then if I knit 2 rounds in stockinette and then bind off, I'm knitting 3 stitches for every column of stitches that I have picked up. When I'm doing the I-cord bind off, I'm also working 3 stitches for every stitch that was picked up, but they're being worked sideways. So these are stacked up and then they roll to, because it's a flat piece and it rolls this way. And then the I-cord is, 3 stitches that are formed into a tube, but it's 3 stitches for everyone. So it's going to use the same amount of yarn. If you were worried about running out of yarn and which is going to be better, neither one. So that's the decision. And so my next step is sewing in the sleeves and then doing the neck, and then I will be finished. So I've done most of the finishing work. I have one sleeve attached, but the other one is not yet. I have put in the I-cord bind off around the neck. And so I can see how adding some structure to the upper part of the body really helps in preventing the linen from stretching out. So I've got shoulder seams right here, and this sleeve cap is sewn in. So I've got seams along the edge here, and you can see how the armhole it's a depth that is what I wanted. There's room still, but it's not super low. On this sleeve, where I've not yet sewn in the sleeve cap, look how low the armhole is. And that is because there's nothing supporting this. This edge is just here. There's nothing holding it up. And the entire weight of the lower part of the top is pulling down on that. So if I had done some kind of a stitch pattern that didn't require anything to be sewn on the edge, that armhole would drag down. So that could be one of the issues that some people have with linen growing. Without seeing the specific garment that they knit, the type of, the yarn weight, the gauge they worked at, all of that, what the construction elements are of the garment, it's hard to know. But there are a lot of people who experience linen growing and then others who don't. So what I experience is that the linen acquires more drape. So right now you can see that this little lace is kind of sticking out a little bit. Once this has been washed, which it has not yet been, it will acquire more drape, and then as it's worn, it will get drapier as well. Hopefully, it isn't going to grow, and the structural elements that I've added to the upper part of the top are going to really help prevent any stretching out. So as I've been wearing this top this morning and doing filming and editing, I can see that the initial stiffness in the lace sleeves is already starting to leave. So linen just acquires more and more drape as it's washed and it's worn. Now I haven't washed this top yet. I didn't have time to wash and block it and have it dry before I was going to wear it for this video. But both of those things, washing and wearing, are going to add softness to the linen, and over time it's going to become incredibly soft and will have lots of drapes. So these sleeves won't be sticking out at all. They'll just be forming over the tops of my shoulders. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.